A loyal guide dog, an unexpected request, and a hidden secret where no one would have imagined. When all seemed lost, a single clue changes the fate of an entire city. The sky dawned cloudy over Sunnyvale Bay, as if nature itself shared the weight that hung over the small coastal town. At the Institute for the Visually Impaired, the curtains remained closed, and an unusual silence dominated the once cheerful corridors. Michael Silverstone, director of the Institute for more than 2 decades, waited in a cold cell for the result of his judicial appeal. Unjustly accused of embezzling funds from the project that helped hundreds of people, he maintained a serenity that intrigued even his guards. The case had become the most talked-about topic in town. At Central Coffee, the traditional meeting point for residents, discussions extended for hours. Mrs. Evelyn, the owner of the establishment for over 40 years, observed the heated conversations while serving her award-winning coffee. "Michael has always been a man of integrity," she commented to her closest customers. "There's something very strange about this whole story." On that specific morning, the cafe was particularly busy. News of Michael's unusual request had spread quickly. He had asked for the presence of Shadow, his faithful guide dog, for one last meeting before the court's final decision. The request, seemingly simple, caused a commotion in the community and generated an intense debate about its true intention. Among the regulars at Central Coffee was Richard Almond, a former student of the Institute who owed much of his development to Michael. Sitting at his usual table near the window overlooking the main square, he absent-mindedly stirred his coffee cup while his memories took him back to his learning days at the Institute. "Michael taught me to see the world in a way I never imagined possible," Richard confided to Mary, former secretary of the Institute who had just joined him at the table. "He always said that true vision comes from the heart, and that our other senses can reveal truths that the eyes can't capture." Mary shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Her face showed the unease of someone carrying a heavy secret. "Richard," she began hesitantly, "there's something you need to know. In the last weeks before all this happened, Michael was different. He spent hours in his office organizing documents, making notes in Braille, and Shadow's behavior changed too." The mention of the guide dog immediately caught Richard's attention. Shadow wasn't an ordinary animal. He was practically an extension of Michael, his eyes in the world and his most faithful companion. "What do you mean by different?" he questioned, leaning forward. "He started training Shadow in a specific way." Mary lowered her voice even more, looking nervously around. "He spent hours teaching new commands to the dog, always alone in his office. And there was something about the collar. Michael had a new one made with a special design." Richard felt his heart race. He knew Michael's methods well. He knew that his former mentor never did anything without a specific purpose. "Mary, do you think he could have—" Before he could complete his thought, the cafe door burst open, and Jason Mendez, the current director of the Institute, entered the establishment. His presence caused an immediate silence in the place. Tall and imposing, with an impeccable suit that seemed out of place for a casual morning in Sunnyvale Bay, Jason walked directly to the counter. Mary visibly paled, and Richard noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she held her cup. Jason had that effect on people since he took over the direction of the Institute, especially on those who had worked closely with Michael. "We need to continue this conversation somewhere else," Mary whispered, already getting up. "There's much more you need to know, Richard. But not here. Not now." As he watched Mary hurry to leave the cafe, Richard couldn't help but notice the lingering look Jason cast in his direction. There was something predatory in that look, something that made his intuition scream that he was on the right track. Michael had left clues, and now it was up to him, Richard, to discover the truth before it was too late. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching us from. We'll continue. The afternoon was already beginning to fall when Richard finally managed to meet Mary again. They had agreed to meet at the old municipal library, a quiet place practically forgotten since the inauguration of the new cultural center in town. Among the dusty shelves and the characteristic smell of old books, Mary seemed even more nervous than at the cafe. "I'm sorry for leaving like that," she began, sitting at one of the solid wood tables. "Jason has eyes and ears all over town, and after what happened to Michael, I learned to be more cautious. Richard pulled up a chair, trying to ignore the creak that echoed through the silent environment. Mary, you need to tell me everything you know. Michael was more than a teacher to me. He was a mentor, a guide. I can't accept that he's guilty. Of these accusations without fighting for the truth. Mary took a deep breath, her restless hands playing with a small notebook she had taken from her bag. In the last weeks before everything happened, Michael was investigating some irregularities at the Institute. He discovered discrepancies in financial reports, donations that never reached their final destination, overpriced equipment. Why didn't he report this immediately? Richard questioned. Because he knew he needed concrete evidence, Mary lowered her voice even more. Michael suspected that there were powerful people involved, people who could easily silence a complaint without solid evidence. That's why he started documenting everything meticulously. Richard remembered Mary's words about Michael's different behavior with Shadow. And what does the guide dog have to do with all this? Mary looked nervously around before continuing. Michael always said that Shadow was more than his eyes. He was his vault of secrets. He developed his own system of communication with the animal, something that went beyond the normal commands of a guide dog. The last time we talked alone, he told me something strange about trusting Shadow to keep the truth. A sudden noise of falling books made them both jump in their chairs. Mary quickly put the notebook back in her bag. It's not safe to continue here. Jason has a board meeting early tomorrow. It will be our best chance to investigate his office. At the Institute. You still have access? Richard asked, surprised. I keep in touch with Rose, the janitor. She always arrives before everyone to clean the rooms, Mary explained. If we get there very early, I can get us in without raising suspicions. As they discussed the details of the plan, Richard couldn't get the image of Shadow out of his head. Michael's request to see the dog one last time wasn't just a gesture of affection. There was something more, something that only those who really knew him could perceive. As he left the library, Richard decided to pass by the Institute. The building, which once emanated warmth and hope, now looked somber under the evening sky. At the entrance, a new and shiny plaque displayed Jason Mendez's name as director. In the side garden, Richard spotted the kennel where Shadow was being kept since Michael's removal. The dog, sensing his presence, approached the fence. His intelligent eyes seemed to carry the weight of an important secret. Richard carefully observed the animal, noticing for the first time the new collar mentioned by Mary. It was different from the others Michael used to use, with a more elaborate finish and reinforced stitching in a specific section. Tomorrow, Richard whispered to himself, tomorrow we'll start unraveling this story. On his way home, Richard didn't notice the dark car that discreetly followed him, nor did he notice the familiar figure observing his movements through the tinted glass. Jason Mendez smiled satisfactorily as he made a call. I need you to postpone the board meeting to the afternoon. It seems we'll have an interesting morning tomorrow. The clock hadn't yet struck 5 when Richard arrived at the wide Institute. The pre-dawn fog covered the streets of Sunnyvale Bay like a protective mantle, ideal for those who needed to go unnoticed. Mary was already waiting for him near the back gate, whispering with Rose, the janitor who had worked at the Institute for more than 2 decades. You have less than an hour, Rose warned, her wrinkled hands trembling slightly as she unlocked the gate. Jason usually arrives at 6:30, always punctual like a Swiss watch. That man gives me the creeps. Richard and Mary entered silently through the service corridor. The Institute at that hour seemed like a completely different place. The empty rooms created strange shadows with the little light that entered through the windows, and the silence was broken only by the distant sound of Shadow's barks coming from the kennel. Jason's office is at the end of the corridor, Mary whispered, guiding Richard through the building. Michael never liked that room, said it was too isolated from the rest of the Institute. Now I understand why. When they reached the office door, Mary took out a bunch of keys from her bag. Rose managed to make a copy, she explained, while looking for the correct key. She has access to all rooms for cleaning. Jason's office was the embodiment of his personality, impeccably organized, with expensive furniture and a minimalist decor that contrasted with the welcoming environment Michael used to maintain. Richard began to methodically examine the desk drawers, while Mary checked the files on the computer. "Here," Mary suddenly exclaimed, her voice still in a whisper. "I found a folder with deleted emails. Jason wasn't very careful in erasing his digital trails." Richard approached the computer, reading over Mary's shoulder. The emails revealed an extensive exchange of messages between Jason and various businessmen in the region. There were discussions about embezzlement, overpricing of equipment, and even plans to transform part of the institute into a commercial enterprise. "Michael must have discovered this," Richard murmured, feeling his heart race. "That's why he started gathering evidence. He knew that Jason was planning to destroy everything we built here." A noise in the corridor made them both freeze. Footsteps were approaching slowly, accompanied by the sound of jingling keys. Mary quickly closed the files and turned off the computer, while Richard put away all the documents they had touched. "Over here," Mary whispered, pulling Richard to a large closet in the corner of the room. They had barely closed the closet door when someone entered the office, through a small crack. Richard could see Jason entering the room, accompanied by a man he had never seen before. Tall, with graying hair and an impeccable suit, the stranger carried a black leather briefcase. "We need to resolve this today," the man said, his deep voice echoing in the silent room. "The documents that Michael hid can compromise the entire operation. And there are rumors that some people are asking too many questions." Jason sat in his chair, a confident smile on his face. "Don't worry, Dr. Mendoza, I've already taken care of it. Our mutual friend in court ensured that Michael won't have a chance to prove his innocence. And as for the curious ones," he made a significant pause, "let's say they'll soon learn to stay in their proper place." Richard felt Mary grip his hand tightly. The man accompanying Jason was none other than the brother of the judge responsible for Michael's case. The pieces were starting to fit together, revealing a much larger conspiracy than they had imagined. The following minutes seemed an eternity as the two men discussed details of their plans. When they finally left the room, Richard and Mary waited, a few minutes before leaving their hiding place. "We need to find these proofs that Michael hid," Richard said, his mind working quickly. "And now we know we have even less time than we thought," Mary agreed, her pale face showing the gravity of the situation. "Michael always said that the truth was in the details, in the small things that people usually ignore. And he mentioned Shadow so many times in the last weeks." At that moment, as if responding to a cue, a strong bark echoed through the institute. Richard and Mary looked at each other, a new understanding dawning in their eyes. "The collar," they said in unison. The path to the kennel never seemed so long. Richard and Mary moved cautiously through the institute's corridors, aware that Jason could return at any moment. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, as the first employees arrived for another day of work. Shadow was restless when they approached his enclosure. The guide dog, a golden retriever with expressive eyes, immediately recognized Richard and began wagging his tail enthusiastically. Mary kept watch at the entrance while Richard approached the animal. "Hey, buddy," Richard whispered, carefully examining the collar. His fingers traced the worked leather until he found the reinforced stitching he had noticed earlier. "Michael always said you were special, that you held precious secrets." With skilled fingers, Richard began to work on the stitching. Years of training at the Institute had developed his tactile sensitivity in a way that few could understand. Each stitch of the seam told a story. Each irregularity in the leather hid a purpose. "Richard, someone's coming," Mary warned in a low voice. At that critical moment, Richard felt something come loose under his fingers. A small compartment opened in the inner part of the collar, revealing a tiny device, a memory card, carefully protected by a waterproof cover. "I found it," he whispered, quickly pocketing the card. Mary appeared at his side, pulling him by the arm. "We need to get out of here. Rose said Jason is coming back with some important people, something about an extraordinary meeting." As they moved away from the kennel, Shadow let out a soft bark, as if saying goodbye. Richard looked one last time at the animal, silently promising that he would return to help him and Michael. The sun was already high when Richard and Mary arrived at Mrs. Teresa's house, a former teacher at the Institute who had retired a few years ago. The lady, known for her discretion and loyalty to Michael, received them with a worried expression on her wrinkled face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she commented, serving tea in old porcelain cups. "What did you discover?" Richard took the memory card from his pocket, his hands trembling slightly. "We need a secure computer to see what's inside here. Mrs. Teresa, do you still have that old laptop Michael gave you?" The elderly woman nodded, rising with surprising agility for her 70-something years. She returned moments later with a laptop that looked like it had seen better days. Michael always said that the most valuable things aren't always the prettiest or most modern. As the computer slowly started up, Mary shared with Mrs. Teresa what they had discovered in Jason's day office. The lady listened in silence, her face becoming more grave with each revelation. "I always knew there was something wrong with that man," she finally said. "Michael knew too. The last time we talked, he told me something I didn't understand at the time. He said that sometimes we need to lose everything for the truth to come to light." The computer finally finished booting up, and Richard carefully inserted the memory card. What they found made all three of them hold their breath. Dozens of files meticulously organized, containing records of secretly recorded meetings, digitized documents, photos of tampered contracts, and most impressively, an audio diary recorded by Michael himself. "My God," Mary whispered, her hands covering her mouth in shock. "He documented everything. Every misappropriation, every illegal negotiation, every threat he received." Mrs. Teresa adjusted her glasses, leaning in to see the screen better. Michael was always very meticulous. He knew he would need irrefutable evidence to face such powerful people. Richard clicked on the last audio file dated the day before Michael's arrest. The familiar voice of his mentor filled Mrs. Teresa's small office. "If you're listening to this, it means that Shadow has faithfully fulfilled his mission, as he always has. What you'll find in these files is just the tip of the iceberg. Jason, Mendez and his associates are not just misappropriating resources from the Institute, they're planning to transform the entire project into a front for their illegal operations. But there's more, much more. In the folder marked Phoenix Project, you'll find..." A noise at the front door interrupted the recording. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house, and authoritative voices called Mrs. Teresa's name. Mrs. Teresa reacted with surprising calmness upon hearing the voices. With a quick gesture, she signaled for Richard and Mary to follow the back corridor, while she carefully stored the laptop and memory card in a false drawer of her desk. Another gift from Michael, who always thought of everything. "Coming," she announced loudly, walking slowly to the door. "You need to have patience with an old lady." Richard and Mary managed to escape through the back door seconds before they heard Jason Mendez's voice echo through the living room. Through the kitchen window, they saw him enter, accompanied by two men in suits who seemed out of place in Mrs. Teresa's cozy home environment. "We need to find a safe place," Mary whispered, as they moved away through the backyards of neighboring houses. "Jason must know we were at the Institute this morning." Richard nodded, his mind working quickly. "I know a place. Michael used to take me there when he wanted to teach me about navigation without visual aid." They walked for almost half an hour, avoiding the main streets and taking alternative paths through the older neighborhoods of Sunnyvale Bay. Finally, they arrived at a small abandoned two-story house near the city's lighthouse. The place, which had once been a music school, had been closed for years, but Richard knew exactly where to find the spare key, hidden inside an old rusty mailbox. Michael used to say that the best hiding places are those that no one else sees value in, he explained, as he carefully opened the door so as not to attract attention. The interior of the house was dusty, but still maintained a welcoming atmosphere. Furniture covered by white sheets created ghostly shapes in the dimness, and the smell of sea breeze mixed with that of old books. "Why did Michael bring you here?" Mary asked while Richard carefully closed the curtains. "This place belonged to his family," Richard replied, removing the sheet from an old table. "This is where he started giving classes to visually impaired people long before the Institute existed. He always said he kept his most precious memories here." Mary took out the notebook and memory card from her bag. They had managed to retrieve them from Mrs. Teresa's house through Rose, who discreetly delivered them during her cleaning rounds. When they turned on the computer again, they went straight to the folder mentioned by Michael in his recording. Phoenix Project. Mary read in a low voice, clicking on the file. My God! The documents revealed much more than simple embezzlement. Jason and his associates were using the Institute as a front for a much larger scheme. Through a network of shell companies, they were not only diverting public resources, but also laundering money from various illegal operations. Look at this, Richard pointed, indicating a specific document. They were planning to turn the Institute into a luxury commercial center. All the work with the visually impaired would be gradually discontinued. Mary continued navigating through the files, each discovery more shocking than the last. Michael discovered all this by himself. It must have taken months of investigation. Not by himself, Richard corrected. He had Shadow. The dog wasn't just his eyes, he was also his protection. Michael must have used the moments when he walked with Shadow to photograph documents, record conversations. A video file caught their attention. It was a recording of a meeting in Jason's office, captured through a hidden camera. In the recording, Jason openly discussed his plans with Dr. Mendoza and other businessmen. The Institute is perfect for our operations, Jason said in the video. Who would suspect a charity institution? Michael is the only problem. He's too respected in the city, has too much influence. We need to get rid of him in a way that no one questions. And we have everything prepared for that, Dr. Mendoza replied, his voice conveying cruel satisfaction. The forged documents are ready. When we're done, no one will believe a word Michael says. Richard felt his stomach turn. They planned everything down to the smallest detail, the accusation, the false evidence, even the speed of the trial. There's more, said Mary, her voice trembling slightly. Look at this list of names. They're important people in the city. Judges, prosecutors, businessmen. Their network is much larger than we imagined. A noise on the floor below made them both freeze. Heavy footsteps climbed the creaky stairs, and male voices discussed in low tones. Richard quickly saved a copy of the files on a flash drive he carried with him, while Mary turned off the laptop. There's a secret passage behind that bookshelf, Richard whispered, moving silently to one of the walls. Michael showed me once. It leads to the basement of the neighboring house. The secret passage was narrow and damp, with cobwebs covering the stone walls. Richard guided Mary through the darkness, his hands sliding along the wall to maintain orientation. Years of training with Michael had prepared him for situations like this, where vision was not an option. Almost there, he whispered, hearing the voices above them become more distant. The basement should be just ahead. When they finally emerged in the basement of the neighboring house, they were greeted by a surprise. Mrs. Teresa was waiting for them, sitting in an old rocking chair, with Shadow by her side. Michael taught me about this passage a long time ago, she explained, a serene smile on her wrinkled face. I knew you would come here, and I brought a friend who was very eager to help. Shadow approached Richard, carrying something in his mouth. It was a small metal box, the kind used to store important documents. The dog carefully deposited it at Richard's feet. How did you manage to get Shadow out of the Institute? Mary asked, impressed. Rose isn't the only one who still has access to important places, Mrs. Teresa replied, with a mischievous glint in her eyes. Some people still remember when I was the director of the Institute before Michael. Jason may have changed a lot of things, but he couldn't change everyone's loyalty. Richard opened the box carefully. Inside, he found more documents, this time the original paper records that Michael had collected throughout his investigation. There was also a small digital recorder and a letter addressed to Richard. Michael knew you would continue his fight, Mrs. Teresa said softly. He always said you had the same fire in your eyes that he had when he was young. Mary, who was observing the street through a small basement window, interrupted the moment. There's movement out there, cars stopping, people getting out. Don't worry, Mrs. Teresa reassured them. This house belongs to Clara Mendoza. Mendoza? Richard and Mary asked in unison, alarmed. Yes, Dr. Mendoza's ex-wife, the lady explained. She left the city years ago after discovering her husband's shady business, but she kept the house and gave me a key. Clara was always a great supporter of Michael's work at the Institute. The sound of a door opening upstairs made everyone fall silent. Footsteps were coming down the stairs leading to the basement. Shadow surprisingly showed no sign of alarm. On the contrary, his tail began to wag excitedly. The basement door opened, revealing an elegant middle-aged woman. Clara Mendoza had her grey hair tied in an impeccable bun and wore discreet but elegant clothes. "We finally meet, Richard," she said with a gentle smile. "Michael spoke a lot about you in his letters." "Letters?" Richard asked, confused. "Michael and I kept in touch all these years," Clara explained. "He knew I could help when the time came. I've been monitoring the activities of my ex-husband and his associates for a long time, collecting my own evidence." Clara walked to an old bookshelf and removed some books, revealing a safe built into the wall. "In here is everything I managed to gather about their illegal operations over the last 5 years. Bank records, suspicious transfers, recorded meetings. I was waiting for the right moment to use this information. And now we have everything we need," Mary completed, her voice filled with hope. "Michael's evidence, his documents, and now your evidence." A soft bark from Shadow caught everyone's attention. The dog approached Richard, gently nudging his leg with his muzzle. "He wants you to read the letter," Mrs. Teresa said. "Michael always said Shadow would know the right moment for everything." Richard carefully opened the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly as he recognized his mentor's braille writing. As his fingers slid over the paper, Michael's words came to life in his mind. "Dear Richard, if you're reading this letter, it means my suspicions were correct. Jason and his associates have finally shown their true colors. But it also means that you, Mary, Mrs. Teresa, Clara, and of course my faithful Shadow, have managed to come together to reveal the truth. There's one more piece to this puzzle, one that will change everything. Look for Rebirth Project in Clara's files. It's time for Sunnyvale Bay to know the true story of the Institute." Clara Mendoza typed a complex combination into the safe, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times. The mechanism opened with a soft click, revealing organized piles of documents, drives, and photographs. "The Rebirth Project," she began, removing a red folder from the bottom of the safe, wasn't just another one of the Institute's projects. It was Michael's original dream, something much bigger than Jason or my ex-husband could imagine. Mary and Richard approached the table where Clara deposited the folder. Shadow, always attentive, sat down near them, his intelligent eyes fixed on the documents that were beginning to be revealed. "Michael planned to transform the Institute into a national network of support centers," Clara explained, spreading architectural plans and projects across the table, not just for the visually impaired, but for people with all types of special needs. The project included research centers, development of new assistive technologies, programs for inclusion in the job market. "That's why Jason was so interested in the Institute," Mary interrupted, understanding. "The land, the structure, the contacts." "Exactly," Clara confirmed. "The Institute is located in an area that has greatly appreciated in value over the last few years. Moreover, Michael had secured partnerships with universities and research centers across the country. The Rebirth Project would transform Sunnyvale Bay into a reference hub for accessibility and inclusion." Richard leafed through old documents, his sensitive fingers capturing every detail of the Braille pages. "There are records here of meetings with international investors, proposals for partnerships with European institutions. Michael was building something revolutionary. And he had the support of powerful people," Mrs. Teresa added, observing everything from her chair. "People who really cared about the cause, not about the profit they could obtain." Clara picked up a specific flash drive among the materials from the safe. "This drive contains something that Jason and my ex-husband would give anything to destroy. These are recordings of meetings where they openly discuss how they plan to use the Institute for their illegal operations. But more importantly, it shows how they discovered the Rebirth Project and decided that Michael needed to be removed before the project became too big for them to control." A noise coming from upstairs made everyone freeze. Shadow raised his, ears alert, but showed no signs of alarm. "It's just Sophie," Clara reassured them, "my housekeeper and a trusted ally." Sophie, a lady with a severe appearance but gentle eyes, came down the basement stairs carrying a tray with coffee and cookies. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said in a low voice, "I thought you might need some energy. Also, I have important news. From town, everyone gathered around, eager for information. Sophie continued, Jason is mobilizing important people. I heard at the market that he called an extraordinary board meeting for this afternoon. They're planning to vote on changes to the bylaws that would give him total power over the Institute's decisions. We need to act before that meeting, Richard said, determined. With all this evidence, we can prevent them from destroying everything Michael built. It won't be that simple, Clara warned. Jason has the support of influential people. We need to be strategic. Mary, who had been silently analyzing some documents, suddenly raised her head. Wait, look at this here. Michael wasn't alone in the Rebirth project. There's a list of supporters, people who signed commitments for investment and support. Among them, Helen Mendez. Jason's sister? Richard asked, surprised. Yes, Clara confirmed, a smile appearing on her face. Helen was always different from her brother. She distanced herself from the family business years ago, precisely because she didn't agree with their methods, and from what I've heard, she's back in town. Shadow, who had been quiet until then, approached Richard and placed something at his feet. It was an old photo that had fallen from one of the documents. In it, Michael appeared next to a woman with a determined expression, both smiling in front of the Institute. Helen, Clara whispered, recognizing the woman in the photo. She and Michael worked together on the original project for the Institute before Jason took control. If we can find her... I already know where she is, Sophie interrupted. Helen is staying at the Marina Hotel using another name. I have a friend who works at the reception. Richard stood up, a new determination on his face. Then we need to talk to her immediately. Helen might be our last chance to stop Jason before the board meeting. We can't just show up at the hotel, Mary pondered. Jason probably has people watching his sister. We don't need to go to her, Clara said, a cunning gleam in her eyes. We'll make Helen come to us, and I know exactly how. Clara's plan was simple, but ingenious. Sophie, using her contacts at the hotel, would deliver an envelope to Helen, containing only an old photo of the Institute and a message in Braille. The Rebirth project still lives, MS. Michael's initials would be enough to pique Helen's curiosity. Michael and Helen had a special code, Clara explained as they prepared the envelope. They used Braille messages even before Michael lost his sight. It was a way to keep their communications private. Richard admired the elegance of the plan. It was exactly the kind of strategy that Michael would have approved, discreet, intelligent, and impossible to be traced back to them. Shadow, lying near the table, seemed to approve of the plan too, his attentive eyes following each movement of the group. Sophie left with the envelope, and the following hours were filled with tense waiting. Mary took advantage of the time to organize the evidence they had collected, while Richard and Clara continued to explore the Rebirth project documents. It's amazing how Michael thought of everything, Richard commented, studying one of the projects. Every detail was planned to maximize people's autonomy and dignity. It wasn't just a support center, it was a revolution in the way society treats people with disabilities. Michael always said that the true disability is in the eyes of those who don't want to see people's potential, Mrs. Teresa said, her voice filled with emotion. He transformed that philosophy into concrete action. The sound of footsteps upstairs interrupted the conversation. This time Shadow stood up, his ears alert, but his tail wagging at a happy rhythm. Clara signaled for everyone to stay calm and went up the basement stairs. Moments later, she returned accompanied by a woman who, despite the years that had passed, still maintained the same determined expression from the old photo. Helen Mendez had arrived. When I received the message, Helen said, her voice choked, I could hardly believe it. I thought everything was lost after Michael. She paused, composing herself. But here you are, keeping the dream alive. Shadow approached Helen, immediately recognizing her. She knelt to pet the dog, silent tears running down her face. You're in this fight too, aren't you, friend? Richard quickly briefed Helen on the situation, explaining the discoveries of the last few hours and Jason's plans for the board meeting. Her expression grew more serious with each revelation. Jason has always been obsessed with power and money, Helen said after hearing everything. When we were children, he already showed this tendency to want to control everything and everyone, but I never imagined he would go this far. We need your help, Mary said. "As a member of the Mendez family, do you still have legal rights over the Institute?" Helen smiled, for the first time since her arrival. "I have more than that. I have 25% of the Institute's shares, inherited from our parents. Jason thinks I renounced them when I distanced myself, but I only transferred everything to a foundation that, coincidentally, has a meeting scheduled for this afternoon. At the same time as the board meeting," Clara completed, understanding the plan that was beginning to form. "Exactly," Helen confirmed. "Jason called this extraordinary meeting because he knows he needs to act quickly. He discovered I'm in town and must suspect I've come to reclaim my rights at the Institute. What he doesn't know is that I never lost them." Richard felt a new wave of hope. "So we can use the meeting to confront him? Expose all the evidence?" "Better than that," said Helen, a familiar gleam in her eyes, the same gleam that Michael had when he was about to reveal a brilliant move. "We can use his own greed against him. Jason prepared this whole meeting to try to change the Institute's bylaws, but for that, he'll need 75% of the votes. Votes he thinks he has. But doesn't," Mary completed, understanding the plan. "And there's more," Helen continued, taking a folder from her bag. "While I was away, I wasn't idle. I gathered my own files on Jason's suspicious activities, including some very interesting transfers to overseas accounts." Shadow, who had been observing everything attentively, suddenly stood up and went to the basement window, his muscles tense. From outside, the sounds of approaching cars broke the silence of the street. "It seems we're not the only ones with plans for this afternoon," Clara said, moving quickly to turn off the basement lights. Jason must have discovered that Helen left the hotel. The basement plunged into tense silence as the car headlights briefly illuminated the small windows. Helen moved quickly to one of the cracks, observing the movement on the street. "3 cars," she whispered. "I recognize the drivers. They're Jason's trusted men." Clara was already in action, moving with surprising agility for her age. "Sophie," she called in a low voice, "activate the contingency plan." The housekeeper nodded and silently disappeared up the back stairs. Shadow, still alert near the window, remained extraordinarily calm, as if he knew exactly what was about to happen. "Contingency plan?" Richard asked, intrigued. "After years of dealing with people like Jason and my ex-husband," Clara explained, "I learned to always have an escape route prepared. Sophie is activating a small distraction that will give us enough time to leave here unnoticed." As if responding to her words, a shrill alarm began to sound a few houses away. From the noise, it seemed to come from a nearby school. The cars that were parked immediately came to life, their engines roaring as they headed off to investigate the sound. "The school's alarm system is a bit sensitive," Clara commented with a cunning smile. "Especially when Sophie decides it needs a routine check." They wasted no time. Helen quickly stored her documents in a folder, while Mary and Richard organized the most important evidence they had discovered. Mrs. Teresa, surprising everyone, revealed a hidden door behind an old bookshelf. "This passage leads to the marina," she explained. "It was built in the times when this region was a smuggler's point. Michael and I discovered it years ago when we were researching the neighborhood's history for an institute project." The tunnel was narrow and damp, but well preserved. Richard, accustomed to orienting himself without vision, safely guided the group using the walls as a reference. Shadow followed right behind, his silent but firm steps serving as an additional guide for the others. After a few minutes of walking, they emerged in a small abandoned warehouse near the pier. The smell of sea breeze was strong, and the sound of seagulls indicated they were close to the sea. "We have less than 3 hours until the board meeting," Helen said, checking her watch. "Jason must have already realized I left the hotel. He's going to try to prevent me from reaching the meeting." "Then we need to be smarter than him," Mary replied, her face illuminated by a sudden idea. "Helen, you said you have 25% of the Institute's shares through the foundation, right?" "Yes, and Jason doesn't know that," Helen confirmed. "But he must suspect you have some trump card," Richard pondered. "That's why he's so desperate to change the bylaws today." "Exactly," Clara said, understanding where Mary was going, "and he'll expect Helen to try to stop him by appearing at the meeting in person." Mary smiled, her plan taking shape. So let's give him exactly what he expects, and something more. Over the next hour, the group meticulously elaborated a plan. Helen explained every detail of how the board functioned, the rules of the bylaws, and most importantly, the loopholes that Jason intended to exploit. He's going to present a restructuring proposal, Helen explained. He'll argue that the Institute needs to modernize, become more efficient. That's how he always operates, using fancy words to mask his true intentions. But we have something he doesn't expect, Richard said, holding the flash drive with the evidence. We have the documented truth, every misappropriation, every manipulation, every threat. And we have something even more powerful, Clara added, looking significantly at Shadow. We have the loyalty of people who truly care about the Institute. Sophie reappeared at this moment, bringing a surprise, a folder with the official seal of the city's notary office. I got it, she said, handing the documents to Helen. Judge, Montero signed everything. He's always been a great admirer of Michael's work. Helen examined the papers, a smile of satisfaction spreading across her face. Perfect. Jason will never expect this. Now, said Mary, we need to split up. Each of us has a crucial role to play, and the timing needs to be perfect. Richard knelt beside Shadow, gently stroking the animal's head. You have an important mission too, buddy, maybe the most important of all. The guide dog looked at him with those intelligent eyes, as if fully comprehending the gravity of the situation. Around his neck, the special collar that Michael had created seemed more significant than ever. It's time, Helen announced, standing up. Jason wants war. Then let's show him how to fight for the truth. The group separated, each heading in a different direction. As they walked, Richard couldn't help but think of Michael. His mentor always said that true strength wasn't in defeating the opponent, but in revealing the truth in a way that no one could deny it. And today, finally, the truth would come to light. The Institute for the Visually Impaired never looked so imposing as on that afternoon. The sun was beginning its descent on the horizon, casting elongated shadows through the windows of the main hall where the board meeting was about to begin. Jason Mendez was in his element, greeting the board members with his characteristic, artificial smile, distributing handshakes and assurances that the Institute's future had never been so promising. On his desk, a carefully prepared stack of documents awaited the moment to be presented. Are all board members present? He asked. His secretary, a young woman who had replaced Mary after her departure. Almost all, sir, she replied, consulting her list. We're just waiting for the representative from the Hope Foundation. Jason frowned for a moment, but quickly regained his composure. The Hope Foundation was one of the Institute's minority shareholders, but their representatives rarely showed up at meetings. It wouldn't be a problem. Outside the Institute, the plan began to unfold. Mary, dressed in an elegant business suit, crossed the main gates with the confidence of someone who belonged there. In her briefcase were the documents that would prove her position as the legal representative of the Hope Foundation. Simultaneously, through the back of the building, Richard and Shadow moved silently through the garden. The guide dog, trained for special situations by Michael, precisely followed each whispered command. They had a specific objective, the control room of the audio-visual system. Clara and Sophie, in turn, took their positions at the cafe across from the Institute, from where they could monitor any suspicious movement. Helen, the central piece of the plan, waited in a car parked a few blocks away, ready to make her entrance at the exact moment. The meeting started promptly at 5 o'clock. Jason, standing before the board, began his presentation with all the pomp the occasion required. Esteemed board members, his voice echoed through the hall, we are here today to discuss the future of the Institute, a future that demands modernization, efficiency, and above all, a new vision. Mary, sitting discreetly among the board members, observed Jason's every move. Through a small device in her ear, she maintained contact with Richard, who had managed to access the control room. Gentlemen, Jason continued, the documents I'm about to present clearly demonstrate the need for a complete restructuring of our administration. The numbers don't lie. They really don't lie, Jason, a firm voice interrupted from the door of the hall. Helen Mendez stood there, her presence causing an immediate murmur among the board members. Jason paused for a moment, but soon recovered his rehearsed smile. "Helen, my dear sister, what a pleasant surprise. But I'm afraid this is a meeting only for board members and shareholders." "Oh, but I am a shareholder," Helen replied, advancing through the hall. "In fact, I represent 25% of the Institute's shares through the Hope Foundation." "Interesting. How you never noticed that detail, isn't it?" Jason's smile visibly faltered. In the control room, Richard activated the audio-visual system, and the screens around the hall came to life, displaying documents and recordings that Jason never expected to see revealed. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Helen continued, her voice firm, "before we vote on any changes to the bylaws, I'd like to present some important information about the Institute's current administration." The next 2 hours were a meticulous unfolding of the truth. Each document presented, each recording played, each testimony brought to light revealed another layer of the web of lies that Jason had woven. Mary, in her moment, stood up to present the financial records she had collected during her time as a secretary. Clara and Sophie, now present in the hall, brought their own evidence about the manipulations and threats. But the most impactful moment was yet to come. When Jason, cornered, tried to discredit the accusations, Shadow entered the hall carrying something in his special collar, a final set of documents that Michael had stored, anticipating exactly this moment. "As you can see," Helen concluded, "the true plan to modernize the Institute already exists. It's the Rebirth Project, idealized by Michael Silverstone, a project that aims not only to maintain, but to expand the vital work we do here." The silence that followed was deafening. The board members, one after another, began to express their support for the original project. Jason, for the first time, seemed to have been left speechless. Shadow, sitting next to Richard, observed everything with his wise eyes. Somehow he seemed to know that his mission, the one Michael had entrusted to him, was finally accomplished. The truth, like a ray of sunlight after the storm, finally shone over the Institute for the visually impaired. The chaos that followed the presentation of the evidence was controlled, but intense. Jason, still standing before the board, tried to maintain his authoritative posture, but the sweat on his forehead betrayed him. His eyes nervously scanned the room, as if searching for an emergency exit. This is an absurd attempt at defamation," he finally managed to say, his voice betraying his insecurity. "These recordings could have been manipulated. These documents could be fake." "Actually, Jason," a deep voice interrupted from the door of the hall, "every document present here has already been authenticated by the Central Notary Office." Dr. Montero, a respected judge in the city, entered the room accompanied by 2 court officers, and the recordings have been examined by independent experts. Helen smiled discreetly. This was the part of the plan that she had kept secret, even from her allies. During her weeks of silent preparation in the city, she had not only gathered evidence but also built a network of legal support that would be impossible to ignore. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Dr. Montero continued, "as a representative of the judiciary, I can attest to the veracity of all the evidence presented here today. Furthermore, I have in my possession a warrant that authorizes immediate access to all computers and documents of the Institute." Jason staggered slightly, leaning on the nearest table. His empire of lies was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. It was at this moment that Shadow, still sitting near Richard, began to bark insistently. The guide dog stood up and walked determinedly to one of the walls of the hall, stopping in front of an apparently ordinary wooden panel. Richard, understanding, the cue approached the wall. His sensitive fingers ran over the surface until they found a small irregularity. With a soft click, the panel opened, revealing a built-in safe. "Impossible," Jason whispered, his face losing all color. "How did he—" "Michael knew every inch of this institute," Helen explained, approaching the safe. "Every secret, every hiding place. This safe was installed when the building was constructed, long before you took control, Jason." Dr. Montero made a gesture, and one of the court officers stepped forward with a safe expert. In a matter of minutes, the secret compartment was opened, revealing piles of original documents, inflated contracts, false receipts, and most impressively, Jason's personal notebook, detailing every step of his plan to take control of the Institute. Michael knew, Mary said, her voice choked with emotion. He knew that one day we would need these documents. That's why he trained Shadow to recognize this location. The guide dog sat majestically, as if aware of the importance of his role. Richard knelt beside him, embracing the animal with gratitude. "But there's still something I don't understand," one of the board members said, standing up. "Why didn't Michael use this evidence before? Why did he allow himself to be removed from the Institute?" Helen exchanged a significant look with Clara before answering. Because Michael knew that it wasn't enough to expose Jason. It was necessary to reveal the entire network of corruption, all those involved, and for that he needed them to feel safe enough to make mistakes. And they made mistakes, Clara completed, pulling more documents from her briefcase. In recent months, while feeling untouchable, Jason and his associates expanded their operations. Every move was documented, every transaction recorded. Dr. Montero nodded gravely, including attempts to bribe judiciary officials. "Isn't that right, Jason?" The former director of the Institute finally collapsed into a chair, defeated. His empire wasn't just crumbling, it was being completely dismantled before his eyes. But the most surprising moment was yet to come. Shadow, agitated, again began to gently scratch at the collar he was wearing. Richard, intrigued, examined the object once more and discovered a final secret compartment, so well camouflaged that it could only be found by someone who knew exactly what to look for. Inside it was a small flash drive and a letter, written in Braille. Michael's words, preserved for this exact moment, were about to reveal the last and most important piece of this puzzle. The boardroom plunged into reverent silence as Richard, with trembling fingers, began to read Michael's letter. His voice, choked with emotion, brought his mentor's words to life. "My dear friends, if this letter is being read, it means the plan worked exactly as I expected. It means that you, united, managed to do what I alone could not. Reveal the truth without destroying the dream we built together. When I first realized Jason's intentions, my initial impulse was to confront him immediately. But I soon understood that this would only result in a war of words, where the truth could be lost amidst arguments and counter-arguments. The Institute was never just a building or an institution. It's a symbol of hope, a beacon showing that disability is not a limitation, but a different way of experiencing and transforming the world. That's why we needed not only to expose the corruption, but also to protect and strengthen the foundations that make the Institute such a special place." On the flash drive that accompanies this letter, you'll find the complete version of the Rebirth Project. Not just plans and projects, but also preliminary agreements with universities, research centers, and international organizations. Institutions that believe in our vision and are ready to turn it into reality. Richard paused, his hands trembling as he touched the last part of the letter. Helen, sensing his emotion, placed a hand on his shoulder in support. "Mary, your dedication and integrity have always been an inspiration. Helen, your strength and determination to fight for what's right, even against your own family, show the true meaning of courage. Clara and Mrs. Teresa, you are the living memory of our mission, the guardians of our deepest values. And Richard, my dear student and friend, in you I see the future of the Institute, your ability to see beyond appearances, to find the truth in the smallest details, is exactly what we need to lead the next phase of our journey. As for Shadow, my faithful companion, he is more than a guide dog. He is the embodiment of our mission. His loyalty, intelligence, and dedication are a constant reminder that limitations only exist in the minds of those who refuse to see beyond them. The Rebirth Project is not just an expansion plan, it's a commitment to social transformation. In the pages that accompany it, you'll find not just architectural projects and financial spreadsheets, but also stories. Stories of people who passed through the Institute and had their lives transformed. Stories that prove our work goes far. Beyond teaching people to deal with visual impairment, we teach people to see with their hearts. Now it's up to you to continue this legacy. The Institute is in your hands, and I'm certain you'll make it an even more extraordinary place than I could have imagined. With love and gratitude, Michael Silverstone. When Richard finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Even some of the older board members were discreetly wiping away tears. Jason, still sitting in his corner, seemed to have aged 10 years in the last few minutes. Helen was the first to recover. With a decisive movement, she connected the flash drive to the room's audio-visual system. On the main screen appeared the first page of the complete Rebirth project, a document so detailed and visionary that it made those present hold their breath. "As you can see," Helen said, her voice firm despite the emotion, "Michael not only foresaw this moment, he meticulously prepared for it. Every aspect of the project was designed to ensure that the Institute would not only survive this crisis, but emerge from it stronger and more important than ever." Dr. Montero, who had remained silent during the reading of the letter, stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board, in light of the evidence presented and the project we've just learned about, I believe we have important decisions to make." Shadow, as if understanding the solemnity of the moment, stood up and walked to the center of the room, stopping exactly under Michael's portrait that adorned the main wall. His noble bearing and serene gaze seemed to echo the words of his former companion. The future of the Institute was in good hands. The days that followed the board meeting completely transformed the Institute for the visually impaired. News of the revelation spread quickly through Sunnyvale Bay, and a wave of support swept over the city. Former students, teachers, and collaborators began to return, bringing with them stories and memories that further reinforced the importance of the work initiated by Michael. On the morning of the first day under new leadership, Richard arrived early at the Institute. The rising sun painted the sky with shades of pink and gold, as if nature itself was celebrating the new beginning. Shadow walked beside him, no longer as a symbol of resistance, but as a living reminder of Michael's legacy. "It's still hard to believe," Mary commented, waiting for him at the entrance. She had agreed to resume her position as administrative coordinator, now with expanded powers granted by the new board. "It feels like we've woken up from a nightmare that lasted too long." The main lobby was buzzing with activity. Volunteers were coming and going, carrying boxes of documents that needed to be organized. Helen, who had been unanimously chosen as the new executive director, coordinated activities with the same determination she had shown during the fight against her brother. "The first international partners have already confirmed their interest in the Rebirth project," she announced, approaching Richard and Mary with a folder of documents. "The University of Barcelona wants to implement our teaching model in their social inclusion program." Clara, who now occupied a position on the advisory board, worked tirelessly to re-establish the Institute's old partnerships. Her experience and connections were proving invaluable for the reconstruction. "Michael always said that the true value of an institution lies in the people who comprise it," she commented, observing the movement in the lobby. "Look how many volunteers showed up as soon as they learned the truth. This is the real spirit of the Institute." Mrs. Teresa, even after gently refusing an official position, became a constant presence at the Institute. Her wisdom and living memory of the place's history were precious sources of inspiration for everyone. "You know what makes me happiest?" she said, sitting in her favorite chair in the inner garden, seeing the smiles returning to the students' faces. "During Jason's period, this place had lost its soul. Now I can hear laughter in the corridors again." The restructuring work was immense, but each small victory was celebrated as an important step in the right direction. The room that once belonged to Jason was transformed into a collaborative space where teachers and students could gather to develop new projects and teaching methodologies. Richard spent hours in this new space, working with a dedicated team to expand Michael's methods to areas beyond visual impairment. The Rebirth project was beginning to take shape not just on paper, but in the Institute's daily practice. "Look at this," Mary called out, entering the room with a radiant smile. "We just received confirmation from the Department of Education. The Institute has been selected as a center of excellence in inclusive education. We'll receive additional resources to implement all the programs envisioned in the project." The news was received with applause and emotional hugs. Shadow, who was resting near the window, raised his head and wagged his tail, as if understanding the importance of the moment. "There's more," Mary continued, her eyes shining with excitement. "The Institute's story has caught international attention. A UNESCO delegation wants to visit us next month to learn about our methodology. Helen, who had just entered the room, added, "And that's not all. I received a call from the governor's office. They want to use our model as the basis for a statewide, inclusive education policy." Richard felt his heart swell with pride and gratitude. Michael's dream had not only survived, it was expanding in ways that even he might not have imagined. Each new development, each new support, each new smile on the students' faces was proof that truth, when revealed with love and determination, had the power to transform lives. That afternoon, as he walked through the Institute's corridors with Shadow by his side, Richard stopped in front of Michael's portrait. His mentor's serene smile seemed even more significant now. "We did it, my friend," he whispered. "Your legacy is more alive than ever." Shadow let out a soft bark, as if agreeing. The sound echoed through the Institute's corridors, no longer as a warning of danger, but as a celebration of hope and renewal. 6 months passed since the Institute's transformation. Spring had arrived in Sunnyvale Bay, bringing with it an explosion of colors and life that seemed to reflect the positive changes in the institution. The sensory garden, one of the first projects implemented under the new management, flourished, with carefully selected aromatic species to stimulate the senses. On a particularly pleasant morning, Richard was leading a group of international visitors through the Institute. Shadow, always by his side, had become a sort of official mascot, charming everyone with his noble presence and impeccable behavior. "As you can see," Richard explained, "our approach goes far beyond traditional teaching. Every space has been designed to promote autonomy and integral development of the students." The visitors, educators, and specialists from various countries marveled at the implemented innovations. The Assistive Technology Laboratory, equipped with the most modern resources, demonstrated in practice how technology could be a powerful ally in inclusive education. "The most impressive thing," commented one of the visitors, a teacher from Finland, "is how you manage to maintain the human essence even with all this technology. You can feel the love and dedication in every detail." Mary, who had joined the group, smiled with pride. "That's Michael's true legacy. He always said that technology should serve people, not the other way around." In the new auditorium, Helen was presenting the preliminary results of the Rebirth project. The numbers were impressive. The number of students had tripled, international partnerships were multiplying, and the Institute's inclusive education model was being adapted in different countries. "But our greatest success," Helen said, her voice filled with emotion, "can't be measured in numbers. It's in the sparkle in the eyes of every student who discovers their potential, in the confidence of every family that finds here a place of welcome and hope." During lunch, served in the newly inaugurated Institute Cafe, a welcoming space where students, teachers, and visitors could share experiences, Clara shared stories of the Institute's early days with the visitors. Michael had a dream, she recounted, of creating a place where limitations were seen as opportunities for growth. "Today, seeing all this, I know his dream not only came true, but expanded in ways he couldn't even imagine." Mrs. Teresa, who continued to be a constant and beloved presence at the Institute, added her own memories. "I remember when this place was just an idea in Michael's heart. He said that one day the Institute would be a beacon of hope for the world. Look around. That's exactly what it has become." In the afternoon, in the meeting room that once belonged to Jason, now transformed into a vibrant, collaborative space, Richard coordinated a video conference with representatives of partner institutions from different continents. The Rebirth project had become a global model for inclusive education. "The secret to our success," he explained to the participants, "lies in understanding that each person has a unique potential to be developed. Our mission is to create the conditions for that potential to flourish." Shadow, lying near the window, raised his head upon hearing a different movement in the hallway. It was a group of new students arriving for their first visit to the Institute. Their faces mixed anxiety and hope, the same expression that Richard remembered having when he first arrived here. "Come," he said, gently interrupting the video conference. "I want to show you something special." He led the group to the Michael Silverstone Memorial, a space dedicated to the Institute's history and its founder. There, besides the official portrait, significant objects were displayed. The first Braille machine used at the Institute, historical photographs, and, in a place of honor, the special collar that Shadow had worn during the crucial moments of transformation. This collar, Richard explained, gently touching the object, reminds us that sometimes the simplest instruments in the right hands and with the right purpose can change the world. One of the new students, a boy of about 12, timidly raised his hand. "Is it true that you were also a student here, sir?" Richard smiled, remembering his own journey. "Yes, and every day I learn something new. Do you know why? Because Michael taught us that true learning isn't just in books or technologies, but in how we connect with each other, how we overcome challenges together." At that moment, as if to confirm his words, Shadow approached the boy, gently touching his nose to the child's hand. The smile that illuminated the boy's face was living proof that the spirit of the Institute was stronger than ever.